Please follow along as I read this morning's scripture from Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 9. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead."
Thank you, George. Mountains are places where people vividly experience the presence of God. At least that's how they're depicted in the Bible. It was on Mount Sinai that Moses spoke with God and received the 10 Commandments, which were given to the Israelites to guide them in their life, to govern their way of being. The prophet Elijah also journeyed to Mount Sinai when he was discouraged and fearful for his life, and there God spoke to him, giving him encouragement and direction. So for Moses and Elijah, the mountaintop experience of this sort of intense communion with God, it was sort of a one-time event. And then they were expected to get on with life back down in the valley. Its purpose was to equip them to be leaders of God's people in the real world, in the ordinary places of life where maybe the presence of God doesn't seem as intimate, as vivid. For them, the mountain was the place where God gave instruction and encouragement and then sent them back into the valley. And this mountain symbolism, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Did you know that snow-capped mountains can be seen from the upstairs study in the manse? No wonder John Calhoun wrote 40 years' worth of sermons right there. Of course, it's different looking at snow-capped mountains and actually being up on the top of one, because you gain a new perspective, don't you, when you're up there? You see things differently. And unfortunately, not all of us can stay up there on the mountain. President's Week, i.e. Ski Week, is upon us. Several younger families obviously are missing today. They're up enjoying the mountaintop views while the rest of us will be tearing up the Mardi Gras floor Tuesday night, the dance floor. Eventually, the skiers will return with stories to tell and perhaps new perspectives. We don't know. But there's a mountain in the Hebrew Bible that serves as a vision of a more constant communion between God and humanity. The prophet Isaiah saw Mount Zion as the eternal gathering place for all peoples in the age to come. We read, "In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many peoples shall come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks, and nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Talk about vision. The essence of that prophecy is still the hope and vision of our faith, is it not? That day will come when all people will experience true and lasting communion with God. Imagine the day when all people experience the same level of communion, not only with God, but with each other. There'll be no need for security checks at the airport and schools. No need for prisons and capital punishment. No need for military budgets. Sorry, aerospace people and Northrop Grumman folk. No need for armed services. No need for police and guns and biological warfare and nuclear weapons. Imagine all the people living life in peace. Oh. It's that vision that likely propels Jesus up the mountain in today's text. He knows his earthly ministry is nearing an end. The time has come to set his face toward Jerusalem, and there he will suffer and die. And such vision comes with a costly price, the price of his life. So Jesus takes his closest ones, right? Peter, James, John, up to the mountaintop. 6 days earlier, Jesus had told his disciples about the fate that awaited him in Jerusalem. He had also told them about the similar suffering that they too would endure as followers of Jesus. The Gospel of Matthew doesn't tell us what took place in those 6 days, but I imagine the disciples were confused and frightened. Who wouldn't be? They probably bombarded with Jesus with questions and tried to offer him an alternative perspective on his future and theirs. Let's try to avoid suffering, shall we, Lord? Let's try to avoid death. Don't go back to Jerusalem. And I suspect we do the same. No wonder Peter doesn't understand what happens next. On the mountaintop, something extraordinary occurs. Right before the disciples' eyes, we're told Jesus is transfigured, his face shines like the sun, and his clothes become dazzling white. I went to the LA Art Show a few nights ago and met one of the young artists who had painted a picture of Jesus in a similar fashion. It was pretty cool. And it sounds fantastic, doesn't it? It sounds a bit over the top for the modern rationalistic minds among us. But that fantastic description, I think, is a literary attempt to put into words a mysterious truth. And that truth is that when people experience real communion with God, a transformation takes place. You don't leave the same. I'm talking about a transformation that's visible on your face. I've seen this with kids when they come back from a week of camp and being loved on and loving and serving and singing and playing. They come back and they're a better version of themselves. How and why this happens remains a mystery. But what happens is clear. Such people reflect in their own being the glory of God. You can use whatever words you want. And whether that's Jesus on this mountain or Moses on Mount Sinai, people who experience close communion with God are transformed. You might say God empties God's self into them, in a sense, and fills them with a divine love that wasn't there in the valley. Now, while Jesus is transfigured on the mountain, we're told that two other figures appear in glory, Moses and Elijah. They too had known a very unique and close communion with God, and they too had experienced mountaintop transformations, and there they speak with Jesus. Now, there's no record of what they said, but I imagine they must have encouraged Jesus to fulfill his God destiny. Whatever they said, it's clear that for Jesus, this mountain is like theirs, a momentary respite rather than a permanent escape from the world. Of course, Peter doesn't see it that way. Poor Peter. He says, Lord, it's good for us to be here on the mountaintop. Let's stay. And if you can wish, Lord, I'll make 3 dwelling places. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Let's not go back down. And I can almost hear the thoughts of Peter suggesting at last an alternative to the way of suffering and death. Here we can not only capture the moment and commemorate the glory, we can stay on the mountaintop. Here people will join us and come away from the cares of the world and see and know the majesty of Jesus in all his radiant glory. Surely this is the way, not the cross. Well, Peter got it wrong. That's not the plan, is it? A voice in the cloud says, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Another translation, "Shut up." And when the disciples hear this, all 3 of them fall to the ground in fear, realizing that they are on holy ground. They are in the very presence of God. And Jesus comes and he touches them and he heals their fears and he raises them up again from death itself, you might say. And when they look around, all of a sudden, they don't see Elijah and Moses anymore. All they see is Jesus. It's interesting, isn't it? The moment of glory has passed. It was just a moment. Oh, how we'd love to linger there, though. The mountaintop experience is over. But listen to what happens as they make their way down the mountain into the valley. Waiting at the foot of the mountain is a young boy seized and racked with convulsions. We might say today with our modern medical understanding, he had an epileptic seizure, who knows. Jesus heals him anyway. Not only that, Jesus continues to heal, continues to teach all the way to where Peter didn't want him to go, to Jerusalem. And for the sake of that young boy and for the sake of the world, it's beyond good that Peter's plan wasn't the plan. He got it wrong on the mountaintop. And it's beyond wonderful that the moment on the mountain was not the end of Jesus' earthly life. Jesus came down to commune with us in our suffering and to offer healing. And we need it, don't we? To take our deaths upon him and touch our lives with healing and grace. There are times in our lives when we too are intensely aware of God's presence with us. Some of you feel closest to God when you're serving, and I think that's beautiful. Others of you in our prayer ministry, you feel closest during moments of prayer. And this Wednesday, that prayer team's going to be right here. And if you want to come in and get some prayer, get some love, light a candle, put it in the sand. You can even have an imposition of ashes, get a devotional, get filled up. For many of you, that's where you feel closest to God. Come on in. 11:30 to 1 on Ash Wednesday, this Wednesday. There are others that experience God literally in the beauty of nature. Out on a surfboard or up on a mountain skiing. And you're filled with a renewed sense of beauty and awe of our Creator. You're filled with faith and hope and peace. Like Peter, we'd like to freeze those mountaintop experiences, wouldn't we? But that's when we need to shut up and listen to God's still small voice. The voice that says, listen to Jesus, follow Jesus. And where does Jesus go? He goes back down. And what does he do? He serves. He heals. He comes back down. So it's no accident that Moses, who represents the law symbolically in this story, and Elijah, of course, who represents the prophets, they disappear. Well, what does that mean? I suppose we could spend a whole lot of time exploring the symbolism of that. I think perhaps it means that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. He descends the mountain with the 3 disciples to fulfill his mission in Jerusalem. And ultimately, the disciples are charged to continue Christ's mission of what? Of increasing love wherever they go, in the hard and hurting places, to whomever they encounter. Isn't that our mission? To serve the South Bay and beyond. We will have an offering where, like we did last Sunday, we'll continue to have it until I'm instructed otherwise, for Syria and Turkey relief. That's on top of your regular giving, please. It's the Spirit of the risen Christ, the Spirit of the law, that guides them and us in the way of Jesus. A way that requires both transformational mountaintop experiences of intimate communion with God that are hard to put words to, and in a way it woos us back down the mountain to serve and be served, to love and be loved, to know and be known. Amen. Whoa! Okay, Craig, our new property manager, we've got something going on with the lectern up here. I don't know.